card. The referee. They're gonna stop this. They're gonna stop.
Welcome to the mother relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. It appears Germany's own unbeaten up-and-comer in the women's minimum weight division, Sarah Bormann, will be returning to action opposite the ring Mexico's own Perez.
Didn't Sarah Bormann just fight?
She did earlier this year, not that long ago, opposite the ring Mexico's own Yadira Bustillos. A very entertaining fight that worked out exactly as I predicted. Sarah Bormann, who's in line to fight for the WBC title at minimum weight.
Sinisi Estrada holds that title.
This contest between Sarah Bormann and Perez is set to go down tomorrow in the women's minimum weight division, a 10-rounder. I don't see the WBC interim title that Sarah won in her last fight on the line. I'm wondering, did she chuck the belt? Did she vacate it?
Sarah sports a professional record of 16 wins with no losses, no draws, 7 knockouts. She's a puncher.
Mid-range to inside fighter, pressure fighter, 33 years old, though she doesn't look it. She's got a baby face.
So she is plenty experienced, seasoned in the women's minimum weight division, and on the cusp of fighting for a full title, a full alphabet title.
She's just got to get through Perez tomorrow. Perez's got an upside-down record. 6 wins and 7 losses with 1 draw.
This reads like a keep busy fight. For Sarah, it is. Sarah, who saw action 2 times last year, she's about to see action for the 2nd time this year. She was in action last month on the 13th opposite the ring, Yadira Bustillos. Then unbeaten.
She's fighting Perez tomorrow.
Perez, who has an upside-down record. Perez, whose career got off to a rather rocky start. Several consecutive losses at the start of Perla's career. 7 losses in her first 8 fights and 1 draw. Talk about a rocky start.
It seems that Perla's career eventually gained some traction. She hasn't lost a fight in some years. She hasn't lost a fight since 2018, and currently she's on a 5 or 6 fight winning streak, having last seen action in October of last year.
So she's got momentum.
Hasn't lost a fight in a while, and she's on a winning streak. I think that Sarah Bormann is going to break that winning streak. In spite of Perez getting her career on track over the years, she hasn't been fighting fighters as talented as a Sarah Bormann, a mid-range to inside pressure fighter that shows real ability.
For Sarah, somebody like Perez is just a keep busy fight, but for Perla, this is a step up, a significant one.
Perez, a mid-range to inside fighter, just like Sarah Bormann.
Though comparatively, Perez is the shorter, much shorter, stumpier fighter of the two.
You can see what she's all about. Fast flurries and combinations in the pocket.
It's going to make for some interesting situations in tomorrow's fight because they're both mid-range to inside fighters, but Sarah Bormann is the comparatively taller and longer fighter of the two. In the pocket,
that range tends to favor the smaller, stumpier fighter with the shorter arms because it's easier for that smaller fighter to work within that crawl space. A taller fighter and a longer fighter with longer arms.
A fighter like Sarah Bormann,
where normally mid-range to inside is her sweet spot, I think there are going to be some interesting situations between her and Perez at that proximity.
I don't think Perez has the same ceiling as Sarah Bormann. I don't, but styles make fights.
Sarah Bormann stays in character and attempts to engage Perez mid-range to inside. She may find that Sarah gets off her shots. She's gonna land.
Because her punches don't have to travel as far. Her arms are shorter.
It's gonna be interesting because Sarah Bormann, more often than not, overwhelms her opponents with volume, flustering them mid-range to inside. But mid-range to inside, that's Perez's sweet spot as well.
See Sarah Bormann's calling card, probing with the jab, stepping into it to get within striking distance of her opponent, behind a high guard.
Very tight.
Chin down, fighting at a slight crouch-wide stance.
What I believe will separate them is a bit of catching and shooting from Sarah Bormann, the unbeaten fighter with home field advantage.
Sarah's definitely a pressure fighter, and she's a volume puncher when she wants to be.
When the situation calls for it, Sarah can catch and counter. She can catch and shoot.
That'll separate them. What you get from Perez is consistent, constant.
Constantly trying to get mid-range to inside on her opponents, constantly throwing.
It's the byproduct of being the shorter, stumpier fighter. The shorter, stumpier fighter in most of her fights, Perez has to play her opponents close to the chest. She doesn't have a choice.
She's got to stay close and she's got to throw. I think that'll be her downfall tomorrow. Sarah Bormann, in spite of being a pressure fighter, she exhibits a little bit more defense.
More than Perla.
She's the taller, longer fighter with the longer legs, longer strides to step out of range if things are getting hairy in the pocket. I like Sarah Bormann on points. I like Sarah Bormann in a war. I don't don't think this is going to be easy for Sarah. Look for this tomorrow.
Tomorrow afternoon on DAZN.
This will be her second fight featured on the platform, and Sarah is a fan-friendly fighter, so
She won't disappoint. Sarah on Points is the pick.
I spoke to him last night. I mean, we haven't got anything for Canelo. We haven't made him an offer, and I knew that he was going to be making a move on the Charlo fight. I don't know the details of the multi-fight deal. Little bit surprised, but I think it's a good move for him, in all honesty. Like, you know, he's at that stage now where, you know, probably the closing phase of his career. I don't have, you know, we've done, I think, his last 7 out of 8 fights because we've had the opponents and the fights that he needs. We couldn't make the Bivol fight, and therefore I don't have a fight for him. So he's going to make his move, and I think it's a good move for him, in all honesty. Like, if he can fight Charlo and he can fight Benavidez, and, you know, I understand the move. For us now, we have to look now at the big pot that's now available to make big fights, and not just one night that would be with Canelo Alvarez, but making a string of big fights for the platform. And now that's what I'll be tasked with. So those conversations that have been bubbling in the background, that certain fights we might not have been able to get over the line for budget reasons, now we can. So yeah, no middle finger. Listen, we've had a great run from it. It's been fantastic for our business. It's been fantastic for DAZN.
the Heymanites are patting themselves on the back right now that Canelo Alvarez went over to their side of things to pounce on their fighters and their hype jobs.
Remember when Manny went over there?
Do you remember immediately after the Jeff Hearn fight that many people thought Manny Pacquiao was done? He was finished. He looked his age, and there was no turning back the clock.
And do you remember that as soon as he set foot on PBC Island, he looked renewed?
Rejuvenated in the Broner fight. Rejuvenated in the Keith Thurman fight. Now, we all know that there's no turning back the clock. There's no going back in time. And the real reason that Manny Pacquiao looked a restored fighter is because PBC fighters, in a very general sense,
A lot of them really aren't elite. A lot of them are B and C, and in some instances, D-level fighters. That's why Manny looked restored.
in spite of what people were saying immediately after the Jeff Hearn fight, that Manny looked his age and he was on the back nine, he was in decline, kind of like what they're saying now about Canelo Alvarez.
Fighting PBC fighters, Manny looked renewed.
I think the same will apply to Canelo.
We haven't got anything for Canelo. We haven't made him an offer, and I knew that he was going to be making a move on the Charlo fight.
Jermall Charlo, a useless fighter and an absentee champion that is doing little more than holding a middleweight title hostage. It's about time that someone got rid of him, and why not Canelo?
Did you guys say that Canelo was ducking these guys?
Isn't that what the narrative has been the last 2 or 3 years or so?
I don't know the details of the multi-fight deal. Little bit surprised, but I think it's a good move for him, in all honesty. Like, you know, he's at that stage now where, you know, probably the closing phase of his career. I don't have, you know, we've done, I think, his last 7 out of 8 fights.
For the last 7 of Canelo Alvarez's 8 fights, he has been with Matchroom.
You see how happy the Heymanites are that he's going to be with them for 3?
Just 3. They're patting themselves on the back and sitting in a circle jerk, jerking each other off at what a good job Al Heyman did, when the only reason Canelo is over there is because he wants to be over there.
He does what he wants.
Because we've had the opponents and the fights that he needs. We couldn't make the Bivol fight, and therefore I don't have a fight for him.
But Al Heyman does. A number of fighters that are willing to prostitute themselves to Canelo Alvarez and sell him their unbeaten records. They weren't doing much with their careers to begin with. The least they can do is service as heavy bags for Canelo Alvarez to punch while making a fuck ton of money.
That's the gist of it.
So he's going to make his move, and I think it's a good move for him, in all honesty. Like, if he can fight Charlo and he can fight Benavidez, and, you know, I understand the move. For us now, we have to look now at the big pot that's now available to make big fights, and not just one night that would be with Canelo Alvarez, but making a string of big fights for the platform.
Matchroom, in the absence of Canelo Alvarez, must crack on, and you may have noticed that Matchroom's adversaries, their rivals, have been taking shots at Eddie Hearn because now Canelo won't be boxing on the platform.
But it's not because of anything Eddie Hearn did or didn't do. He just doesn't have the opponents for Canelo. The only one he's got is Dimitri, and that's not happening.
And now that's what I'll be tasked with. So those conversations that have been bubbling in the background, that certain fights we might not have been able to get over the line for budget reasons, now we can. So yeah, no middle finger. Listen, we've had a great run from it. It's been fantastic for our business. He's been fantastic for DAZN.
Immediately after that news was announced that Canelo Alvarez would be crossing over to the PBC side of things for 3 fights, a deal worth an estimated $100 million, in excess of $100 million, you saw Eddie Hearn's rivals starting to take shots at him as if Canelo left due to ineptitude or hard feelings.
Canelo leaving Matchroom wasn't like when he left Golden Boy Promotions.
Canelo doesn't have an axe to grind with Eddie Hearn. He wasn't trying to put distance between himself and Eddie Hearn, questioning his loyalty the way that he questioned Oscar De La Hoya, who immediately started taking jabs at Eddie Hearn.
The difference between you and Eddie is Eddie and Canelo are still on amicable terms. You and Canelo aren't.
You fucked up your relationship with Canelo Alvarez, and you've been bitter about it ever since.
I saw Oscar De La Hoya taking shots at Eddie Hearn. I even saw Lou DiBella. I saw Rick Glacier
saying something along the lines of Eddie Hearn not understanding the American market is why Canelo Alvarez left.
What the fuck's he talking about?
Alongside Eddie Hearn, Canelo Alvarez broke the indoor attendance record in America. He's promoted some very big shows for Canelo Alvarez, a homecoming fight.
What the fuck's he talking about?
Ineptitude is not the reason that Canelo Alvarez went from Matchroom to the PBC.
Yeah, it's all right. Look, I think it's quite flattering, really. I think when you want someone's demise so badly, who you don't know, or there has to be a reason for that. So what is the reason? And the reason normally is that you're envious of that person.
That's true.
The fact is, Lou DiBella is absolutely sick as a dog that he doesn't have my deals around the world. And he doesn't have my shows. And he doesn't have my business. Because he feels that he should be having them. Well, guess what? Tough shit. You ain't got him. Leonard Ellerby, sick as a dog, don't do any shows anymore.
He doesn't.
So he's looking at me going, why is he getting all these dates? What? He wants to be me.
Leonard's just an employee.
Oscar De La Hoya clearly wants to be Eduardinho Hearn. So I just like, just tickling the nuts and just pulling their plonker. But it is weird at the same time. Do you know what I mean? But I guess everyone just keeps telling me how flattering is it that all these promoters just keep talking about you. So it is a bit tiring.
The old saying goes, when you're in the light, if they're not hating on you, it means you ain't doing it right. I mean, haters, they don't hate down. They hate up.
If Matchroom as a company weren't a global promotional outfit, promoting shows transatlantically, not just transatlantically, in many, many different territories around the world.
If they weren't doing as well as they are doing, with or without Canelo Alvarez, let's say that Matchroom here today were in the same state that Rock Nation was before they shut down, or Main Events before they shrunk.
Right.
People wouldn't bother to take jabs at Eddie Hearn. They wouldn't bother.
If Matchroom as a company were in the same state as Don King's promotional company.
If they didn't do all these shows, and if they didn't have all these deals, if they weren't doing as well as they're doing, do you think people would bother to take jabs at Eddie Hearn? Of course not.
For what?
What would be the point? They take jabs at Eddie Hearn as a cumulative, as a group, because he's so successful, because he's doing so well. Oscar De La Hoya, in particular, who seems to blame Eddie Hearn. He almost blames Eddie Hearn for the strained relationship that he has with Canelo Alvarez. When that got started, long before Eddie Hearn even came into it, there were issues.
Now you see in the Haymanites patting themselves on the back that they've got Canelo Alvarez for 3 fights, just 3 fights. But if having Canelo for 3 fights is cause for celebration, how about having had him for 7?
He's been with Matchroom for 7 of his last 8 fights, and they've been a successful 7 fights, some of the biggest.
But you're seeing the Haymanites celebrating this acquisition, the biggest they've had in a very long time. And it's not just, Canelo being who he is, but it's because they needed him.
Now more so than ever before. Here on the channel, we've been talking about this entire ordeal between Showtime being merged into Paramount and Paramount trimming the fat, shedding the excess, the 2 waves of layoffs that we saw the last couple of months,
Right.
the budget cuts, the show cancellations,
Right.
boxing being in jeopardy.
The abysmal year that Showtime had last year.
They were in a bad way last year, but they got off to a good start this year. They did.
Very good pay-per-view buys. Very good reception for the Gervonta Davis versus Ryan Garcia fight, even if the fight itself played out like a mismatch commercially, it did very good.
You ask yourself, well, if Showtime was in a bad way and their boxing budget has been shrinking annually, shrinking over time, how can they afford Canelo Alvarez? And that's just it.
This is not a run-of-the-mill fighter. This is not your run-of-the-mill ordinary fighter. This is quite literally the top draw in the sport.
Save Anthony Joshua, Canelo Alvarez is one of only 2 boxers in the Forbes list as top-earning athletes in their respective sport. You get Canelo Alvarez on board and you get him to your side of things, it's not a gamble investing in him, paying out what you gotta pay him.
You ask yourself, if their budget has been shrinking over time, how can they afford him?
He's good for the money, that's why. He may be more expensive than everybody else, but he generates more than anybody else. So if you've got to pay this guy 45, 50, maybe even 60 million, or in this instance, over 100 million for just 3 fights, that's money that he's good for.
He won't just bring you your money back, you'll get to generate money.
Make money. There's getting back what you put in, breaking even, and then afterwards you actually get to make some money. Canelo Alvarez, more so than everybody else, can make that possible. What he generates, what he generates in terms of revenue and what he generates in terms of interest, which the Showtime platform sorely needs.
Now more so than ever, because Showtime has to justify to their higher-ups why they should keep investing in the sport of boxing. The numbers that they brought in with the Garcia versus Davis fight, the Canelo Alvarez acquisition, that will help them do that.
In a lot of ways, Canelo Alvarez is saving their ass going over there. Because, you know, Spence versus Crawford is a great fight, but I don't know what that's going to do at the box office. And even though Gervonta Davis did really well with Ryan Garcia earlier this year, in his next fight, depending on who he fights, he might drop back down to just over 200,000 buys a fight.
He won't do 1 million.
He'll go back to doing what he was doing before. Just north of 200,000 pay-per-view buys, which is nothing to write home about.
Now Canelo versus Charlo, Canelo versus Benavidez.
Alongside Canelo, this 3-fight deal that extends into the following year, you have a genuine opportunity to keep staging some of the biggest fights in the entire sport of boxing, which could adequately communicate a message to the higher-ups at Showtime that boxing is still worth investing in.
That's how he's saving their ass.
They need him, whereas Canelo doesn't really need them. I mean, he could have elected to box Edgar Berlanga, and while it would have been perceived as a cherry pick, he would have still made a fuck ton of money picking that cherry, if he wanted to pick a cherry.
Well, I mean, the whole PBC stable's a bunch of cherries.
The PBC are set to have a very big year, the biggest year in the sport that they've had in years. They will be staging the biggest fights in all, if not most, of boxing this year.
And they need to.
But if the question is, how can the PBC afford Canelo Alvarez if their budget has been shrinking over time? It's simple. It's because you can afford to break the bank on Canelo. You can. Because he, unlike many other fighters, can not only bring you your money back, but allow you to make money.
He more so than many others.
More than anybody else. It's a gamble with other fighters, but it's not a gamble with him. It's a guarantee. Whatever he does, it's gonna draw. It's gonna sell.
That's the difference.